Everyone called him the orphan she took in. For 10 years, that was the lie. But on her wedding day, someone found the truth hidden in an old envelope. And when the secret came out, in front of 200 guests, if she's not my mom, why do I have her last name? What happens next changes everything. Ethan Carter had learned, over 41 years of living, that the best things in life rarely announce themselves with fireworks. They arrived quietly. A phone call, a glance across a crowded room, a Tuesday that turned out to matter more than anyone expected. That was how Vanessa Brooks had entered his life. Quietly, completely. He stood now in the guest bedroom of her colonial-style home in Cedar Hill, an affluent suburb outside Atlanta, holding a small cardboard box he had no business going through. The wedding was 4 days away. He'd only been looking for the spare phone charger Vanessa swore was somewhere in this closet. His fingers had brushed against something stiff, tucked beneath old sweaters. A manila envelope, edges soft with age, the kind of envelope that had been opened and closed so many times it had started to give up. He shouldn't have opened it. He told himself that later, 100 times. You shouldn't have opened it, Ethan. But he did. Inside were photographs. A younger Vanessa, maybe 23, 24, standing on a hospital lawn somewhere with palm trees in the background. Her face was different then. Softer. Scared. In her arms, wrapped in a yellow blanket, was a baby. A black baby. Ethan's stomach did something strange, a slow drop, like missing a step in the dark. He told himself it could be anything. A photo from charity work. A relative's child. Vanessa had done mission trips in her 20s. She'd mentioned that once, in passing, the way people mention things they don't want to discuss further. Then he found the certificate. It was folded into quarters, soft as cloth from handling. He opened it carefully, like it might crumble, like it might bite. Certificate of live birth. Child's name, Noah Elijah Brooks. Mother, Vanessa Marie Brooks. Father, redacted. Ethan read it 3 times, 4 times. He sat down on the edge of the guest bed because his legs had stopped being reliable. Noah. Their Noah. The quiet 10-year-old boy who had spent the last year and a half slowly, carefully learning to trust Ethan. Who had taught Ethan how to skip stones on the lake behind the house. Who had cried the first time Ethan took him to a Braves game because nobody ever took me anywhere before. Noah, who Vanessa always introduced with the same smooth, practiced sentence. This is Noah. His mother was my dearest friend. She passed when he was small, God rest her, and I couldn't bear to see him go into the system. So he's ours now, in every way that matters. Ethan had admired her for that story. He'd told his own mother about it with something like pride. Can you believe that, Mom? She took in a stranger's child and raised him like her own. That's the kind of woman Vanessa is. His mother, a retired school teacher from Macon who'd raised 3 boys on a teacher's salary after Ethan's father left, had simply said, in a way that Ethan, at the time, hadn't thought twice about. Now he understood that He sat in that guest room until the light through the window turned orange, then gray, the birth certificate trembling slightly in his hands, not because he was angry yet. He wasn't. Not really. Not in that first hour. He was something else. He was a man realizing that the foundation of his house had been built on sand, and he hadn't even known he was standing on sand until it started to shift. Ethan had grown up in a small house on Pine Street in Macon, Georgia, the middle son of Loretta Carter, a woman who could stretch $1 further than anyone in the neighborhood and who had instilled in her boys 2 unbreakable rules. Tell the truth, even when it costs you, and take care of people who can't take care of themselves. He'd carried those rules through 22 years as an electrician, through a marriage that ended quietly when his first wife passed from cancer 6 years ago, through the loneliness that followed, and into Vanessa, who ran a successful interior design firm, who chaired the women's auxiliary at her church. who had introduced him to a world of charity galas and golf club brunches that Ethan had never imagined himself belonging to. He had loved her. He still did, in the strange, numb way you can love someone even while the ground is cracking beneath your feet. But he loved Noah more. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected to feel, somewhere in the last 18 months, like he'd found a son he never knew he was looking for. And now he was holding proof that the boy's own mother had spent 10 years pretending he wasn't hers. That evening, Vanessa came home from a final dress fitting, glowing, talking about the seamstress and the bouquet, and whether the string quartet would need a sound check. Ethan watched her move through the kitchen, graceful, composed, every gesture practiced to perfection, and for the first time in 18 months, he felt like he was looking at a stranger. "You're quiet," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," he said. He didn't show her what he'd found, not yet. Something in him, the electrician's instinct maybe, the part of him that never flipped a breaker without first tracing every wire, told him he needed to understand the whole circuit before he touched anything. Because something didn't add up. If Vanessa had wanted to hide Noah, truly hide him, why keep him in her home at all? Why not give him up entirely all those years ago? Why take the risk every single day of someone finding out? There was a piece missing. Ethan could feel it, the way he could feel a short in a wall before he ever found it, a faint hum of wrongness in the walls of this house. That night, lying beside Vanessa in the dark, listening to her breathe, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to blow up the wedding based on a piece of paper and a guess. He was going to find out the truth, all of it, before he said I do to a woman whose entire life, it seemed, might be built around a lie. The next morning, Ethan drove to Macon under the excuse of checking on Mom before the wedding. Loretta Carter answered the door in her housecoat, took one look at her son's face, and said, "Sit down. I'll put the kettle on." "Mom," Ethan said, once they were seated at her small kitchen table, the same table he'd done his homework on 30 years ago. "When I told you about Noah, about how Vanessa took him in, you said, What did that mean?" Loretta's hands stilled around her teacup. She was quiet for a long moment. "Ethan, baby," she said finally, "do you remember Patrice Boudreau?" Ethan frowned. "The woman from your church book club? The one who moved to Savannah?" Patrice's sister Carla used to work for a cleaning service. Years back, must be 10, 11 years now. She cleaned houses in Buckhead. One of those houses belonged to a family named Brooks. Loretta's eyes met his, steady and sad. Carla used to talk about a young woman in that house, pregnant, hidden away almost. The family was ashamed, Carla said. Real ashamed. Something about the father of the baby. Ethan's chest tightened. Ashamed because the father was a black man, Loretta said simply. And the Brooks family, old Atlanta money, the kind of family that's been on the same boards and in the same churches for 4 generations, they did not want that story getting out. Carla said the daughter disappeared for almost a year, came back different, quiet, and nobody in that family ever spoke of it again. Ethan sat back in his chair, the pieces sliding into place with a click that felt like a physical blow. "You knew," he said. "All this time, you suspected—" "I suspected," Loretta said gently. "I didn't know, Ethan, not for certain, and it wasn't my place to go digging into another woman's pain based on something I heard secondhand 11 years ago. But when you told me that story, a dear friend who passed, a boy nobody could place, the way you said Vanessa never wanted to talk details," she shook her head. "Baby, I've heard that story before, just with different names." Ethan stared at the steam curling off his tea. "There's a difference," Loretta said quietly, "between a woman who made a mistake when she was young and scared and a woman who spent 10 years still making that same mistake every single day to a child who can feel it." She reached across the table and took her son's hand. The question you need to answer, Ethan, isn't what happened 11 years ago. It's what kind of person is she now? And you've got 4 days to find that out. Ethan drove back to Cedar Hill with his mother's words sitting heavy in his chest. He didn't go inside the house right away. Instead, he sat in his truck in the driveway watching the lights come on in the windows, the kitchen, where Vanessa was probably going over the seating chart again, the upstairs bedroom, where Noah's small reading lamp glowed against the curtain. That lamp. Ethan had bought that lamp. 6 months ago, Noah had mentioned, quietly, the way Noah mentioned everything, like he was testing whether his words would land somewhere safe. That he liked to read after bedtime, but his old lamp had burned out, and Miss Vanessa said we'd get to it eventually. Ethan had driven to the store that same evening and bought the kid a lamp shaped like a little lighthouse. Noah's face when he opened it, that careful, disbelieving joy, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to feel that happy, had stuck with Ethan for weeks. This boy has her last name, Ethan thought, staring at that warm yellow light. He sleeps under her roof. She signs his school permission slips, and she still calls him the son of a friend to every person who asks. What kind of fear does that? For 10 years. He thought about what his mother had said, about the Brooks family, old Atlanta money, 4 generations on the same boards. He thought about the framed photos in Vanessa's hallway, her parents at the country club, her grandfather's portrait in his judge's robes, the family crest stitched into a throw pillow in the formal living room that nobody was allowed to sit on. He thought about the one time, early in their relationship, when Vanessa had taken him to meet her mother, Eleanor Brooks, at the family's estate in Sea Island. Eleanor had been polished and pleasant, the kind of pleasant that had edges if you looked closely. At one point, Noah had wandered into the room to ask Vanessa something, and Eleanor's whole demeanor had shifted. Not cruel, nothing so obvious as cruel, but cooler. A barely perceptible withdrawal, like a window cracking open in winter. "Run along, sweetheart," Eleanor had said to Noah, in a voice that was perfectly polite and utterly final. The grown-ups are talking. Ethan hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it sat in his memory like a stone in his shoe. He went inside. Vanessa was at the kitchen island, laptop open, scrolling through floral arrangements. Noah sat at the table doing homework, a math worksheet, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration, a habit Ethan found unbearably endearing. "Hey, bud," Ethan said, ruffling Noah's hair as he passed. "Fractions?" "Yeah," Noah said, making a face. "I hate fractions. Nobody likes fractions. You just gotta out-stubborn them." Ethan sat down across from him. "Show me what you got." For the next 20 minutes, Ethan worked through the worksheet with Noah, breaking fractions down into pizza slices, the way his own father, on the rare occasions his father had been around, had once shown him. Noah's frustration slowly melted into focus, then into the quiet satisfaction of a kid getting something right. "You're good at this," Noah said when they finished. "Like, you're good at explaining stuff." "I had good teachers," Ethan said. Noah was quiet for a second, erasing a stray mark on the page. Then, without looking up, he said, "Are you going to be around after the wedding? Like, a lot? Or just sometimes?" The question landed in Ethan's chest like a dropped wrench. "Why do you ask that?" Noah shrugged, the universal gesture of a kid trying to make a big question sound small. "I don't know. People come around sometimes, and then they don't." "Noah." Ethan waited until the boy looked up at him. "I'm not people who come around sometimes. You understand me?" Noah studied his face for a long moment, the way kids do when they're deciding whether to believe an adult, a skill Ethan suspected Noah had been forced to develop too early. "Okay," Noah said finally, and went back to his homework. But Ethan saw the small, hopeful smile the boy tried to hide. This kid has been let down before, Ethan thought. More than once, by people who were supposed to be permanent. And the worst of it was, Ethan now knew, the person who had let him down the most wasn't a stranger or a foster placement. It was the woman sitting 12 feet away, scrolling through centerpiece options for a wedding where this child would be standing up front in a tiny suit, holding rings while the world was told, again, that he belonged to someone else. That night, after Noah went to bed, Ethan finally showed Vanessa the certificate. He didn't lead with accusations. He simply placed it on the kitchen island, smoothed flat, and watched her face. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life, the way the color left Vanessa's face in stages, like a tide going out. The way her hand holding her wine glass went very still. "Where did you get this?" she said. Not a question. A demand wrapped in a whisper. "Vanessa," Ethan said quietly, "is Noah your son?" The silence that followed stretched so long that Ethan thought she might simply refuse to answer at all. Then Vanessa set down the wine glass with exaggerated care, as though the glass itself might shatter if she moved too fast, and sat down on the kitchen stool like her legs had given out. "You don't understand," she said. "You don't understand what my family is, what they would do. What they would do to you. Or what they would do to him," Ethan asked. His voice was steady, but something in his chest was burning. "Because from where I'm standing, Vanessa, only one of you has been paying the price for this for 10 years. And it's not you." "I was 23, Vanessa said, and now there were tears, real ones, sliding down her face. "I was 23, Ethan, and I was in love with a man my family said I was never, ever allowed to bring home. And when I got pregnant, my father—" Her voice cracked. "My father told me that if I kept the baby and acknowledged it, I would lose everything, every connection, every door that had ever been opened for me, every relationship in this town. He said the Brooks name had survived 4 generations without scandal, and it wasn't going to end with me." "So what happened to him?" Ethan asked quietly. "Noah's father?" Vanessa wiped her face with the back of her hand. "His name was Marcus. He was a contractor. He was renovating my parents' guest house. That's how we met. When my father found out about the pregnancy, She swallowed. "He paid Marcus to leave town, told him I'd had a miscarriage, told me that Marcus had taken the money and run, that he never wanted anything to do with either of us. Did you believe that?" I didn't know what to believe. I was 23 and terrified, and my whole family was telling me one story, and I had no way to check it. Vanessa's hands were shaking now. "I went away to finish school in Charleston. That's the story everyone got. I had Noah in a private facility 2 hours from here. And then I came home, alone, and my mother said, 'We will never speak of this again.' And for 10 years, Ethan, we never did." "But you kept him," Ethan said. "You didn't give him up." "I couldn't," Vanessa said, and for the first time, her composure broke entirely. "I held him for 10 minutes after he was born, and I knew I could not give him to strangers. So I told my parents I was bringing him home as a ward, a charity case, a friend's orphan child, and they let me, Ethan, because the story was respectable. Charity is respectable. A Brooks woman raising her own mixed-race child is a scandal. A Brooks woman taking in an orphan is a good deed." She laughed bitterly, brokenly. "Do you understand what that means? I have spent 10 years performing generosity toward my own son so that my family would let me keep him in my house." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. "And Noah," he said finally. "Does he know any of this?" "No," Vanessa whispered. "He thinks his mother died. He thinks I took him in out of kindness. He has no idea that the woman he calls Miss Vanessa," her voice broke completely, "is the woman who gave birth to him and has been too much of a coward to ever say so." Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the den long after Vanessa had gone, sobbing to her room, turning the whole story over in his mind like a piece of wiring he couldn't make sense of. Here was the truth. Vanessa Brooks was not a villain in the way Ethan had first feared. She was a woman who had been 23 and powerless, manipulated by a father who weaponized her love for her child against her, told a lie about the man she'd loved, and then spent a decade living inside a smaller lie because the alternative, the truth, would have meant losing the only family member willing to let her keep her son under any roof at all. But understanding why a wound happened didn't heal it. And the person carrying the deepest wound in this house wasn't Vanessa. It was a 10-year-old boy 2 rooms away, sleeping under a lighthouse lamp, who had spent his entire life being told, implicitly through silence, through the careful construction of a story, that his own existence was something to be managed, minimized, explained away. Around 2 in the morning, Ethan went up to check on Noah, the way he sometimes did, just to make sure the boy's nightlight hadn't burned out. He found Noah's door cracked open and the boy sitting up in bed, hugging his knees, wide awake. "Hey," Ethan said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Can't sleep?" Noah shook his head. "I heard you guys talking. Downstairs. Not what you said, just that you were talking a lot." And Miss Vanessa was crying. Ethan's heart sank. Of course he heard. Kids always hear. "Are you guys not getting married anymore?" Noah asked. And his voice was so carefully neutral, so braced for disappointment, that it nearly broke Ethan's heart in half. "No, buddy, that's not it," Ethan said. He thought about all the things he could say. Deflections, reassurances, grown-up stuff. Don't worry about it. And he thought about his mother's voice across her kitchen table. "Tell the truth, even when it costs you." "Noah," Ethan said carefully, "can I ask you something? Has Miss Vanessa ever told you much about your mom? Your birth mom?" Noah shrugged in the dark. "Just that she was nice, and she died when I was a baby, and Miss Vanessa was her friend. That's pretty much it. I used to ask more when I was little, but..." He shrugged again. "It made her sad to talk about, so I stopped asking. It made her sad to talk about." Ethan almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about it. A 10-year-old protecting an adult's feelings about his own mother's death, about his own life. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "that there might be more to that story than you've been told. And I think you deserve to know all of it. But it's not really mine to tell, Noah. It's going to have to come from Miss Vanessa, okay?" Noah looked at him for a long moment, and in the dim glow of the lighthouse lamp, Ethan saw something shift in the boy's face. Not fear exactly, but a kind of bracing, like someone who had spent their whole life waiting for a shoe to drop and had just heard it leave the closet. "Okay," Noah said quietly. Ethan stayed until Noah fell asleep, then sat in the hallway for a long time thinking. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Wedding preparations continued on the surface. Caterers confirmed, the rehearsal dinner planned, Vanessa's sister Diane flying in from Charlotte. But underneath, something had fundamentally changed. Vanessa was quieter, gentler with Noah than Ethan had ever seen her, lingering at the breakfast table, asking about his day with an intensity that suggested she was trying to make up, in small moments, for 10 years of careful distance. But she hadn't told him. Not yet. "I don't know how," she admitted to Ethan, 2 nights before the wedding, sitting on the back porch while Noah slept upstairs. "How do you tell a child, 'I am your mother, and I let you grow up believing I wasn't because I was afraid of what people would think of me?' How does that not destroy him?" "I think," Ethan said carefully, "the longer it waits, the more it'll feel like one more thing being hidden from him. He already knows something's different, Vanessa. He's a smart kid. He's been picking up on things his whole life. The way your mother looks at him. The way you've never once called him son in 10 years, even in private. Kids feel that stuff even when they can't name it." Vanessa was quiet for a long time, looking out at the dark yard. "My mother's coming to the wedding," she said finally. "And my father." Her voice tightened. "He's never said Noah's name once. Not once, in 10 years, not even at Christmas." Ethan felt something settle into place inside him, a decision he hadn't fully realized he'd been building toward. "Vanessa," he said, I think this needs to happen before the wedding, not after. And I think it might need to happen with everyone there, not as a spectacle, but because secrets like this don't get smaller by staying hidden. They get bigger. And Noah has spent 10 years standing at the edge of a story everyone else already half knows. I think it's time the rest of the room caught up to him. Vanessa turned to look at him. In the porch light, her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "You're not asking me to ruin the wedding," she said slowly. "I'm asking you," Ethan said, "to stop letting a wedding be more important than your son." The morning of the wedding, Cedar Hill Community Church filled with the particular hum of a town's social elite gathering for an event. 200 guests, the scent of white lilies, a string quartet warming up near the altar. Vanessa's parents sat in the front pew, Eleanor in pearls, Robert Brooks in a charcoal suit, both of them perfectly composed, perfectly pleasant, exactly the way people who have spent a lifetime concealing things learn to be. Noah stood near the front in a small navy suit, holding the rings on a small velvet cushion, his face solemn with the seriousness of his job. Ethan stood at the altar, watching the doors at the back of the church, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had told Vanessa what he planned to do, or rather, what he hoped she would choose to do, because this couldn't come from him. It had to come from her. That was the only way it would mean anything. The music began. The doors opened. Vanessa walked down the aisle in white, radiant, and absolutely terrified. Ethan could see it in the set of her jaw, the white-knuckle grip on her bouquet. She reached the altar. The minister opened his book. And then Vanessa turned, not to Ethan, but to the congregation. "Before we begin," she said, and her voice shook but did not break, "there's something I need to say. Something I should have said 10 years ago." A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the pews. Eleanor Brooks' smile froze on her face like a photograph. "Many of you know Noah," Vanessa continued, gesturing toward the boy standing near the front, who looked up, startled, the ring cushion trembling slightly in his hands. "I've told all of you, for years, that Noah is the son of a dear friend who passed away, that I took him in out of kindness." She took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. "That was a lie. Noah is my son, my biological son. I gave birth to him when I was 23 years old, and I have spent every single day since then ashamed, not of him, never of him, but of what I thought my family, my community, and people in this very room would think of me if they knew the truth. So I built a lie, and I made my own child live inside it, and I am done. I am done." The church had gone utterly, perfectly silent. 200 faces frozen. Noah stood very still, his eyes wide, the ring cushion forgotten in his hands. He looked at Vanessa, and Ethan saw the exact moment the words landed, saw 10 years of unasked questions rise up behind the boy's eyes all at once, and then, into that vast silence, in a small, clear voice that carried through the entire sanctuary, Noah asked, "If she's not my mom, why do I have her last name?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than that. It was the simple, devastating logic of a child who had just been told the world he understood was not the world that actually existed, trying, desperately, to find a single fixed point to hold on to. Vanessa's composure shattered completely. She crossed the small distance between them and knelt down, heedless of her wedding dress pooling on the church floor. So she was eye level with her son. "Because you do have my last name, baby," she said, her voice raw. "Because you've always been mine. I never stopped being your mother, Noah. I was just too scared to say it out loud. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry. What happened in the next 10 minutes would be talked about in Cedar Hill for years, but not, Ethan would later realize, in the way anyone in that church might have predicted. Noah didn't run. He didn't cry, not at first. He stood very still, the ring cushion now hanging forgotten at his side, looking at Vanessa kneeling in front of him in her wedding dress. And he asked one more question, quieter this time, just for her. "Were you ever going to tell me? If Ethan hadn't found out?" It was the most important question of the entire morning, and Ethan watched Vanessa understand that. "I don't know," Vanessa said honestly, tears streaming down her face, ruining 10 years of careful composure in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. "I want to tell you yes, but I think I might have kept being scared forever if something hadn't forced me to stop." From the front pew, a voice cut through the silence, cold, controlled, furious. "Vanessa, this is not the time or the place." Robert Brooks had risen to his feet. Eleanor sat frozen beside him, her face a careful blank, the kind of blank that takes generations of practice. Vanessa stood up slowly, and when she turned to face her father, something in her had changed. Ethan could see it, the way you can see a wall finally give way after years of pressure. "You're right, Dad," she said. "It's not the time or place for this." It was never the time or place, was it? Not for 10 years. Not at Christmas, not at Easter, not once, not one single time. Did you ever say my son's name? You sat in this town for 10 years and let everyone believe I was doing charity work because the alternative was admitting your daughter loved a black man and had his child. And that was a story you couldn't survive. "Vanessa," Eleanor started, her voice tight. "No, Mom, I'm done." Vanessa's voice was shaking, but it didn't waver. "I let you make me ashamed of my own son for 10 years. I let him grow up in a house full of people who loved him with conditions attached. And today, in front of everyone, he asked me a question I should have answered the day he was born." She looked back at Noah. "You have my last name, Noah, because you are my son, and you have always been my son. And from this day forward, everyone in this room and everyone in this town is going to know that. Not as a secret, not as a story, as the truth." The church remained silent. But it was a different silence now. Ethan saw faces in the pews shift, soften. He saw an older black woman near the back, someone he didn't recognize, wiping tears from her eyes. He saw a young couple holding hands, the woman whispering something to the man. And he saw Eleanor Brooks, the woman who had once told a small boy to run along, sweetheart in her own perfectly polite, perfectly cold voice, sitting very still, her composure cracking in a way that looked, for the first time in Ethan's experience of her, less like disapproval and more like grief. The wedding did not happen that day, not as planned anyway. But something else happened, something Ethan would think about for the rest of his life as the moment everything truly changed. Vanessa walked over to Noah, knelt down again, and simply held him. Not the careful, slightly formal hugs Ethan had seen between them over the past year and a half. A real embrace, the kind that comes from 10 years of holding something back, finally letting go. "I'm sorry," she kept saying into his hair. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And Noah, this quiet, careful boy who had spent his whole life testing whether things were permanent before he let himself believe in them, wrapped his small arms around her and said, in a voice thick with tears, "It's okay, Mom, Mom." The word landed in the church like something physical. Ethan, standing at the altar in his wedding suit, felt his own eyes burn. 2 pews back, an elderly man Ethan didn't recognize, black, dignified, in a gray suit that had clearly seen better decades, rose slowly to his feet. The church turned to look at him. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I think I might be able to help finish this story." He made his way to the front, leaning on a cane, and Ethan realized with a jolt that he recognized something in the man's face, the same set of the jaw, the same eyes that he'd seen in Noah 100 times. "My name is Walter Ellison," the man said. "Marcus Ellison was my son." Vanessa rose slowly, her hand finding Noah's shoulder, her face draining of color again. But this time, Ethan saw, not from fear, from something closer to hope, almost too fragile to hold. "Marcus didn't take any money and run," Walter said, his voice gaining steadiness as he spoke. "He never would have. He loved you, Miss Vanessa. He talked about you for months after your father ran him off. Told him he'd lose his contracting license, his livelihood, everything if he ever came near you again. Marcus left town because he had no choice. He had a sister to support, and your father made it clear what would happen if he stayed." Walter's eyes filled. He died 8 years ago. Heart attack. He never knew he had a son. The church was utterly silent. Noah looked up at the old man with wide eyes. "I read about this wedding in the paper," Walter said softly, looking at Vanessa, then at Noah. "I saw the photo. And I saw a boy who looked exactly like my Marcus did at that age, and I had to come. I had to know." He looked down at Noah, and his weathered face broke into something between a smile and tears. "Hello, young man," Walter Ellison said gently. "I believe I might be your grandfather." The wedding happened 3 weeks later. Smaller, quieter, in the backyard of Vanessa's home rather than the grand church, with maybe 40 guests instead of 200. Walter Ellison sat in the front row, in a new gray suit Noah had insisted on helping him pick out. Over the past 3 weeks, Walter had become a fixture in the house, teaching Noah how Marcus used to whistle a particular tune while he worked, showing him old photographs, filling in 10 years of missing history with the patient generosity of a man who had spent 8 years grieving a son he never got the chance to reconcile with, and had just been handed, unexpectedly, a grandson. "He's got Marcus's hands," Walter told Ethan one afternoon, watching Noah help Ethan fix a creaky porch step, a skill Ethan had been slowly teaching him for months. Same exact hands, steady, patient. Marcus was like that too. Could fix anything if you gave him time. Eleanor and Robert Brooks were not at the wedding. That relationship would take longer, might never fully heal, Vanessa admitted. And for the first time in her life, she had decided that was a cost she was willing to accept. "I spent 38 years trying to be a daughter they could be proud of," she told Ethan the week before the wedding. "I think it's time I tried being a mother my son can be proud of instead." Diane, Vanessa's sister, had stayed, had, in fact, been the one to quietly call Walter's number after finding it in old family records, helping arrange for him to come to the wedding without anyone, including Vanessa, expecting it. "Somebody in this family needed to start fixing things," Diane said simply. "Might as well be me." The ceremony itself was simple. Vanessa wore a different dress this time, not the elaborate gown from before, but something simple and pale blue, the color, she told Ethan, that Marcus's favorite shirt had been, according to Walter. A small tribute, quiet but deliberate. Noah stood beside them both, not as a ring bearer this time, but as something else entirely. When the minister reached the part of the ceremony for vows, Ethan turned not just to Vanessa, but to Noah as well. "I made a promise to myself 18 months ago," Ethan said, his voice thick, "that I would never be someone who comes around sometimes and then doesn't. Noah, I want to make that promise to you, out loud, in front of everyone. I'm not just marrying your mom today. I'm choosing to be your father, for real, for keeps, for every birthday and every bad day and every fraction worksheet from here to forever. If you'll have me." Noah, 11 years old now, his birthday having passed quietly the week before, the first birthday Vanessa had told him through tears that she got to celebrate as his mother openly in front of everyone, nodded, unable to speak, and stepped forward to hug Ethan right there in front of the small gathering. Ceremony rules, be damned. From the front row, Walter Ellison wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and said, to no one in particular, Marcus would have liked this man. A year later, Ethan stood on the back porch of the Cedar Hill house. Their house now, all four of them, including Walter, who had moved into the renovated guest cottage out back, watching Noah and Walter sand down an old wooden chest that Walter had found in his attic. Inside, it had been Marcus's old tools, carefully preserved, untouched for over a decade. "He wants to learn carpentry," Vanessa said, coming to stand beside Ethan, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. "Walter's teaching him. Says Noah's got Marcus's hands for it." "He does," Ethan agreed. They watched in silence for a moment. Walter patiently showing Noah how to follow the grain of the wood, Noah's face set in that familiar expression of careful concentration, tongue poking out slightly, just like he did with fractions. "You know," Vanessa said quietly, "I spent my whole life thinking that if the truth ever came out, it would destroy everything. My family, my reputation, everything I'd built." She watched her son laugh at something Walter said, bright and unguarded in a way Ethan had never seen in the early days. Instead, it gave him a grandfather. It gave him a piece of his own history he never knew existed. It gave me back 10 years of being able to call him my son out loud. She looked at Ethan. "All those years, I thought the lie was protecting us. It wasn't protecting anything. It was just delaying the day we finally got to be a real family." Ethan put his arm around her, and they stood together, watching their son learn to shape something useful out of raw, unfinished wood. Patient, steady work, the kind that couldn't be rushed, the kind that left something real behind when it was done. "Dinner's almost ready," Vanessa called out to them. "Noah, wash up. Dad, you're staying, right?" "Wouldn't miss it," Walter called back, and Noah, grinning, sawdust on his hands, ran toward the house, toward the warm light of the kitchen window, toward a family that, after everything, had finally stopped hiding from itself. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything, but in the end, made things better, not worse? Share your story in the comments. And remember, the truth doesn't always destroy what we've built. Sometimes, it's the only thing that can finally let it grow.